Look, I feel a little bit of a duck out of water, not talking about sustainability per se, but I will touch a bit on about that towards the end. And I must say, it does feel nice wearing a suit. It's probably about 2.5 years since the last time I did a face-to-face presentation, so it actually feels quite nice and nice to see people here in the audience and also people online as well. So look, I suppose my presentation today will talk about the use of timber products and compliance. So before I move on, in terms of who Wood Solutions is, Wood Solutions is an initiative that's been funded, or that is funded by Forest Wood Products Australia. So I undertake the codes and standards work for Forest Wood Products Australia, and one of its programs is Wood Solutions. Forest Wood Products Australia undertakes a whole range of activities for the industry. So the codes area, we do market-related work, we do a whole lot of research and development in a whole range of areas. So as Jason mentioned, it's the most frequented timber website in the world. So it's a very massive website with a whole host of information. The information is provided, it's basically non-commercial in terms of we don't push a product. We are funded by the whole of industry in terms of products that are produced in Australia, the wood that's grown by forest growers, so there's a levy collected on that, as well as imported timber products. So we don't bear any sort of allegiance to any timber product. We'll talk to you about anything in relation to use of timber and wood products. There's a whole lot of free online resources that are available, as well as continuing professional development courses. There are R&D projects, and I get involved in a lot of that from a fire perspective, which is predominantly what I'll talk to about today. So actually don't worry. So the timber products, from an appearance perspective, as we see in the studio here today, it has a warm, natural appearance, and it's what designers as specifiers really would like to use. But today what I'll focus on is the National Construction Code, in terms of talking about how timber products can be used within the commercial environment. Then I'll talk about how it's then used and specified under the NCC. And you'll note that I've got in blue there NCC 2022. You may or may not be aware, but the National Construction Code's gone through a fairly detailed format review. So some of the clauses have changed, and also the formatting of clauses has changed as well. So where I've remembered to, I've put in the NCC 2022 in brackets in blue, so you can sort of get a feel for what the changes are. And then I'll also talk about the use of timber in bushfire-prone areas towards the end of the presentation. My key focus will be on Volume 2, the NCC Volume 2, or I talk about the NCC, but it's also the Building Code of Australia. It can be termed the same way, but Volume 1 is the one I'll be focused on, which is on commercial buildings. So it covers all the types of building classes that we have. And it also covers on all these specific areas, such as the structural design, and I'll focus on the fire resistance or the fire performance of products. So the NCC basically governs how we build our buildings. What are all the requirements that we need to achieve? When we look at compliance and compliance with the National Construction Code, basically there's two pathways that we can look at. So we have the performance requirements. They are the key mandatory requirements under the National Construction Code. You must comply with the performance requirements. But then there's a couple of pathways. On the left-hand side, the performance solution pathway, that's where you engage, say, a fire engineer to come up with some innovative or solution that doesn't quite fit into the deemed to satisfy or deemed to comply pathway in the National Construction Code. Or there is the deemed to satisfy solution. So that's basically you follow this, tick, you can use the product or the system. My focus today will be on the DTS pathway, so the simple way of complying with the National Construction Code. One of the key things in relation to compliance, the National Construction Code requires that you have the appropriate evidence of suitability for the product. That can be achieved through a number of different ways. You may have heard of Codemark, which is like an independent group, or there's companies, but you go to get a Codemark certificate. Well, they'll look at all the information that you provide with your product and the application you want to use that in, and they'll make it a judgment and an assessment, and then issue a Codemark certificate if that's appropriate. Then there's also just a certificate of accreditation. They can be issued by a state-based organisation. In Victoria, we have a group called BRAC, Building Research and Advisory. I keep getting the acronyms wrong. But anyway, there's a group that you can go to get your product assessed and accredited for use in Victoria. There are similar types of bodies around the country. You can also get go to another body to get issued a certificate that isn't either a code mark or like a state-based approval agency. The key group that, as an industry, that we go to is an accredited testing laboratory. So where we're trying to demonstrate compliance from a fire perspective, we will go through and get various tests done in accordance with the National Construction Code. Then you can go through professional engineers or appropriately qualified people to do some additional work or something that doesn't quite fit the National Construction Code deemed to satisfy a pathway. Industry is starting to produce technical product statements or product technical statements. Basically, the industry will say, here's our product, this is how it's been manufactured, this is how it's been graded, this is how it's been assessed, and this is how it's to be used. So there'll be a technical statement that's issued by the industry, by a company, to say this is our product and this is what it complies with and this is how it's used. Then you get engineers or someone similar to just comply with the Australian Building Code protocols. It could be for design or software is another key area where there are protocols. But as I mentioned, from a timber industry perspective, because we have products, we go down to a testing pathway. So we engage with groups like CSIRO or Warrington Fire here in Victoria to undertake the required testing and then issue us with a report that will detail the product and give you the performance or what it achieves to enable you to use that product in the market. Now, we have our publicly available technical documents on the Wood Solutions website. The Wood Solutions website is so large, I do this all the time. There's a little search box and I just put fire test reports and hit search and it'll come up as one of either the first or second link to find it. But that's basically the email, or not the email address, sorry, the address for to get the fire test reports. One thing to point out, in the National Construction Code, we've been doing fire test work for decades in Australia. Up until the 1st of May this year, there were a whole series of test reports that were issued using previous test method standards. So the NCC, as of the 1st of May this year, basically says that you need to have checked compliance with your fire test reports, that they are in accordance with the current test method. So this is an extract out of the NCC. So the NCC will list the various fire test standards. So these are out of the AS 1530 series, and they issue the date of that test method. So the interesting one is the last one, Part 4, which is about building elements. So when we talk about fire resistance levels on a wall or a roof ceiling system, those test reports must now be in accordance with the 2014 edition of that test standard. Now, from a timber use perspective, we do have systems that can be used, and Jason mentioned the building code now allows us to build multi-storey timber frame buildings. So those buildings, if you're building an apartment building, 8 storeys, the walls need to be fire rated, the floor ceiling systems need to be fire rated. So we have test reports to the 2014 test method standard to show that these products comply, or these systems comply. But what I'll focus on today is more about linings, internal use of timber products. So under the National Construction Code, under the fire provisions or fire resistance provisions, it has a specific section about fire hazard properties. So this is about the materials that we use within our buildings. You'll note in the blue are the new clause numbers for the I'll say the 2019 version are in black and the 2022 are in the blue. So the clause, the fire hazard properties clause has got broken down to a number of specifications. which asks you to meet a particular performance level in order for that product to comply. So just as a bit of a flow chart. So if we're looking at the type of building, I won't be talking about Class 1 buildings, which are basically our houses, so they won't be covered under here, but in effect there aren't any requirements under the NCC. If we're looking at sort of timber joinery, such as windows, handrails, anything sort of internal skirting boards, cabinetry, etc., there are no requirements under the National Construction Code for use within buildings. The key thing that I'll focus on are the floor, wall and ceiling linings. So I'll go with the current clause, which is specification C110. Just to be clear, the NCC 2022 hasn't been called up yet. I understand that next day or so the ministers will make a formal decision as to the call-up of the NCC. I'm going to divert my discussion a little bit. The key issue that's being discussed are condensation matters and thermal efficiency, whether or not we do go full 7-star energy efficiency for housing across the country, or whether or not some states pick it up and others don't, or whatever. So they're the sort of decisions that we'll find out in the next couple of days. But as I said, my focus will be on the wall and ceiling linings. There's another clause that talks about using of timber products in other applications, which I won't touch on here, which require fire hazard indices, which the industry does have that information as well. But I'll focus on wall, ceiling and floor requirements. So when we're looking at floors, one of the key aspects you look at is my building sprinklered or not? If your building is sprinklered, then for floors there's a critical radiant flux requirement. If there isn't a sprinkler system throughout your building, then you've got to achieve your critical radiant flux as well as what they term a smoke development rate. And I don't need to worry about those too much. I'll show you that in a moment. If we're looking at the wall and ceilings, again, is the building sprinklered? If it is, for walls and ceilings, you need a group number for your material. If it's not, if your building has no sprinkler system, then you need a group number as well as your smoke growth rate or the average specific extinction area. The smoke growth rate and the average specific extinction area are items that come out of the test. So you don't need to know too much about that. That data will be provided to you. The lift cars, again, the requirements are a critical radiant flux value on the floor and a group number on the wall or ceiling. And I'll talk about these in a moment. So if we focus on the wall and ceiling linings, what do these group numbers mean? Group 1 is a material that if there's a fire in your building, you don't get that massive, the flame and the blowout, the flashover where everything ignites at the same time. Group number 2 has this, doesn't reach this flashover within this test protocol within these periods. Now, from a timber perspective, we do have products that can achieve Group 2. Group 1, no. In effect, Group 1, you start to think about non-combustibility in terms of the achievement. Now, Group 3 is basically a cover-all that covers the vast majority of timber products. So timber products will generally achieve a Group 3. There is a Group 4 rating, which isn't actually used in our building code or our National Construction Code. So I mentioned that there's these other criteria about the smoke criteria, and they're specified, the level that you need to achieve is specified in the building code, and the industry's documentation will provide that information. So this is just a quick summary of the tables. We've sort of cobbled this together, this table. But if we just focus on the Class 2, which are basically residential apartment buildings, you'll see, looking at the second column over, is the building sprinklered or not? If you go along the building isn't sprinklered, you'll have particular, in this instance, group number ratings for the material. So when you're getting into, in this case, a non-sprinklered building, sort of fire-isolated exits, you can't put a material that doesn't achieve a Group 1. As you move on in throughout the building, so you've got public corridor space with no sprinklers, you basically can't use a timber product if the building doesn't have a sprinkler system there. If we're then going into specific areas, and this sort of more like the sole occupancy unit, so where people live, you can put timber basically throughout your whole building. So you can make it look like a sauna if you wanted to within your apartment or the unit. So if your building is sprinklered, then you'll note that timber then can be used in other areas such as the public corridors. So it enables you, the sprinkler offsets any ability for that flashover type event. So that gives us the ability to utilise more timber products. So I suppose they're sort of the key little sort of markers as to the things you need to look for in your building, which will then determine what types of products you can put in there. So I did mention basically specific areas, and this is out of the National Construction Code. It will define what these areas are. Now, the industry does put out test reports, and these are a couple of test reports for group numbers. So we'll have the properties for, in this instance, for plywood use. And the minimum thickness on this test report is for 6mm thick plywood. And it'll talk about the types of glues that have also been assessed. So plywood is a product, but can be manufactured in different ways. Different glue types can be used. This particular report, we did a whole lot of work comparing the fire performance of different glues, and this particular report pulls all that data together into one report. We've also got reports where we're using substrate materials such as MDF. So we can have MDF or a particle board substrate and then put a timber veneer on it. So we've got reports that also enable you to utilise these composite type products within commercial buildings. One of the things I don't think I highlight on the presentation, but we'll also dictate when these reports are valid too. You'll note just the bottom one at the last line towards the end in brackets. In the past, you had to open up the report, have a look through it, and find out, is this still up to date or still current? So we're putting all that information out so people can search that quite easily. So this is basically what the internal part of the report will look like. The formal assessment, as it states, so there'll be a list of timber species down the left-hand side, and they'll give you a minimum thickness requirement. In this instance, we're looking at solid timber products, saying a minimum thickness of 9mm, 9mm or greater, and you'll achieve a Group 3. And it'll nominate the average specific extinction area in accordance with the building code or the National Construction Code. So all that information is found in one place. So basically the report will have all that information in there. Just a bit of a hint, the work that we've done found any timber that's got a density of at least 400 kilograms a cubic metre and a 9mm thickness will achieve a Group 3. I'll say that I've actually put that in as a code change, asking that sort of information be put into the code so people don't have to keep hunting around for test reports. And as an industry, we have to keep maintaining and keep reviewing and updating it, and it becomes painful after a while. So overseas, they've actually got an automatic approval for 400 kilograms a cubic metre or greater to achieve their equivalent of a Group 3. That's in the European standards, have that at the moment. So when we look at doing products and testing, this is actually the test standard, AS/NZS 3837. There are some variations that are permitted within the test sample prior to being put into the test machine. So there are some variations in that. One of the things I'd point out is people often talk about acoustic panels, and I want to put holes, sort of space throughout my panel. Once you start doing that, you step outside the solid wood. So all the stuff I was talking about was solid wood panels or products. Once you start to put penetrations and holes through them, you sort of get outside the test method requirement, which details what the limitations are, and you end up having to do a full-scale test. So these are sorts of panels that I'm talking about when you've got various holes and slits and penetrations through that panel. You end up having to go through a full-scale room burn. We basically line the room on three sides of that room, lined with your product as well as the ceiling. They put a fire in the back corner, and then they just measure all the smoke that comes off and how long it takes, if it does, to flash over. So all that stuff's measured. But it is an expensive test to do. But once you start to go away from solid wood or solid finishes, that's the only pathway you have for compliance purposes. And then when you do this type of test as a room burn, then you need to look at what's the makeup of my system. So it's not just my panel with holes in it. What's behind my panel? Have I got any acoustic fabric behind there? Is there a fire-rated material behind there? What's the support mechanism? So when you go do a test report, that's probably a bit of background to those that are potentially thinking of going down that path. You really got to think clearly about what you're going to test, because at the end of the day, the test lab will say, this is what we tested. And then you go out on site and say, I'm not going to use my steel battens, I'm now going to put timber battens of this sort of dimensions and size. The lab will say, we have to do an assessment of that. You can't just use our other test report. And that may work in your favour or may not, but I'm just flagging, when you test, you need to really think clearly about what you're going to test, because at the end of the day, the testing lab can only say, this is what we tested and this is how it performed. So I suppose work closely with the labs as we do every time we go do a test. So that's about walls and ceilings, linings. Now we'll focus on flooring products. When you go do a floor test, basically that's the test rig. There's a radiant panel that's on an angle in that rig, which emits a certain radiant heat, and the product is horizontal. And then they'll ignite that sample and then see at what point that ignition or that fire goes out, and then they'll work out what the radiant heat is at that point. So there's a standardised test method, and under this test method it's expressed as a critical radiant flux value. Under the National Construction Code, again, the building classes are nominated. That's in Table 2 down the left-hand column. It'll nominate the type of building, and then it'll again break it down into, does your building have a sprinkler system or does it not? And depending on the answer to that question, you'll have to achieve a particular critical radiant flux value. So the second column over, where the building's not fitted with a sprinkler system, you need this minimum critical radiant flux value of 2.2. Sometimes we get people not quite sure what that means. Under the test reports, they'll nominate a value for your product. You need to at least achieve 2.2 or greater under this table for that particular configuration, so no sprinkler systems. So again, under the Wood Solutions website, we've got our test reports there that will nominate a couple of reports for the critical radiant flux values. So the first one was for solid timber of 15mm thickness, and the second one is for flooring up to 19mm thicknesses. So again, the required values are all provided there. And again, inside the report, you'll nominate various options. So you can actually install your timber flooring as, like in this example, in this studio, where the flooring might go over the top of a substrate, be it concrete or it could be particle board or whatever. Our tables are broken down in that same regard. We'll say, is the timber flooring product installed over a substrate, or is there an air gap behind? Because that can have an impact in terms of burn through the floor and potentially how that performs as a system. But our reports make that clear as to how those values have been provided, so be it either installed on a substrate or not. So as I mentioned, there's a whole range of information on the Wood Solutions website. As an industry, we only go through accredited testing laboratories to do the work. So as I mentioned earlier, CSIRO or Warrington Fire here in Victoria or in Dandenong. And you need to ensure that you've got the appropriate evidence of suitability. So we do have it for, as I mentioned, for internal products, flooring, linings, etc. But the website also contains it for building elements, as well as for timber buildings. So we've got full-scale test reports for someone who wants to build an 8-storey building out of lightweight timber construction. We've got accredited test reports there. Now, one of the things that I was asked to do is also talk a little bit about bushfire, and it was interesting to see there's a question from online about bushfires. The one thing that we get fairly regularly is people sort of mixing and matching terminology between the National Construction Code and the bushfire standard. So don't confuse the fire provisions that have gone through just now with the bushfire provisions or the requirements. So there's a difference in terms of the key features you're looking for. So on the left hand, the National Construction Code, we mentioned about the group numbers, the critical radiant flux. There's also fire hazard indices, which are under this other clause that I didn't go into, but we do have information for those. But then when you talk about bushfire use and timber products, basically you're looking at either a density requirement in the lower bushfire levels. So, or maybe I'll take a step back. The bushfire standard has 5 levels of what they term bushfire attack levels. BEL 12.9 is BEL 12.5 is a 12.5 kilowatt per square metre of radiant heat onto your structure. BEL 19 is 19 kilowatts per square metre radiant heat. BEL 29 is 29, BEL 40 is 40, and then we have flame zone. So flame zone is basically your structure gets immersed in flame contact. So with the timber product mindset, there are standard deemed to satisfy provisions for BEL levels up to and including BEL 29. I'll talk about what you do when you go beyond that. So we do have solutions beyond the BEL 29 level. So basically this is all under volume 2. So the AS 3959 that I'm referring to is in relation to our class 1 or our domestic housing type structures. So when we build in a bushfire prone area, basically when we look at using timber internally within the structure, you can use it in any bushfire attack level. So from BEL 12.5, I'll call it the lowest level, through to flame zone. It doesn't impact on the house frames. You can use timber frames throughout. You can use all the internal linings, flooring, cabinetry, everything else that you'd like within the structure. The bushfire standard is all about stopping the embers and the heat getting in to the structure. So the external cladding and systems protect the frames in the lower BEL levels. As we go to the higher ones, we then use systems to protect our frames. So this is just a very quick summary. I didn't want to go, doing a bushfire presentation, I can spend an hour just on that. But I just wanted to just go through, just give you a quick run through. So at the low levels of, there's a bushfire attack level low, which basically means you're not really in a bushfire attack level, but there is a category, let's call it that. But I'll focus on the areas where you need to do something. So when you're looking at window and door applications, there is a density requirement, so minimum density of 650 kilograms a cubic metre. So for those of us here in Victoria, the Vic Ash is a 650 kilogram a cubic metre material, so it can be used in the lower BELs as our window joinery. Then as we move up into our these higher density species, so anything that's got a 750 kilogram a cubic metre or greater, you can then use that as external wall cladding under the deemed to satisfy. So in the BEL 12.5 and BEL 19 levels. When we move up to the BEL 29, which is sort of like, I'll call it the cutoff for the simple deemed to satisfy pathway for timber, we've got 7 nominated hardwoods that can be used as achieving BEL 29. And those hardwoods went through a testing program over 20 years ago now to enable them to get into the standard. There are products now that are fire retardant treated that can be used in bushfire areas that can actually be used up to and including BEL 40. So these are preservative treated and fire retardant treated radiata pine products. So there are some products that are available, and I'm aware of another company that's in the throes of getting another one in place. So industry is very actively trying to find solutions to enable more timber products to be used. So when we do go beyond our BEL 29 level, which I'll call it the cutoff, then we start to look at systems, a systems approach. So this is basically a fire-rated wall system. Under the bushfire standard, you need to achieve what's called a fire resistance level of 30 minutes for structural capacity, 30 minutes for integrity, so that nothing gets through that wall, and 30 minutes for insulation. So on the back face of your wall, you can't have a temperature rise, I can't remember the number, but there's a temperature rise on the back face. So basically these fire-rated wall systems have been around for decades. So each of the, in this instance it's a fire-grade plasterboard system. Each of the major plasterboard manufacturers will have this type of system in their catalogue where you can apply timber cladding to it. I'll use it a caution, because you're using the plasterboard on the outside where it's potentially close to the weather, use a moisture-resistant type fire-grade or fire-rated plasterboard for that external use. One layer of 16 will actually give you twice the performance as required in the standard, and it's just because that's what the industry had in terms of their catalogues. So the one layer of 16 will give you 60-minute FRL. As I say, it's twice what the bushfire standard asks you to achieve. But there is also a timber roof system that was tested, and it was tested by Forest and Wood Products Australia. When the bushfire standard was first released, there were no solutions at this level, this flame zone. They had a test method, but no one had the opportunity to do a test. So the industry went out and actually came up with a roof system. This is just with a corrugated or a steel type roof system on top. And again, it uses fire-grade plasterboard. So we had our fire-rated wall that had plasterboard on the outside. That plasterboard then extends across the eave line, goes up the face of that of the roof, and protects fire getting in where that eaves, or the fascia. So stop any fire getting in. To stop the embers getting in, as well as any of the heat, where you've got the corrugations in the roof, there's insulation right at the junction at that fascia level. There's a compressed amount of insulation to stop any embers or any heat getting through. And then there's a fairly 75 mil, well, it's 55 originally, but it's 75 now, Anticon blanket that was tested, that then gets compressed in that corrugations and forms within that corrugation as well. So it gives you a very, very highly insulated roof system. As I said, this was the first full-scale tested roof system that was done to comply with the AS 3959 requirements. Look, I thought going through technical stuff would be fairly heavy, so I thought I'd try and finish on a bit of a lighter note. I know we're talking about sustainability and use of timber products, and as we get the feel from the studio how lovely it is to be surrounded by a lot of timber throughout the studio. And there are some documented benefits that have been done, and this was with a Pollinate who did a bit of work on the health and well-being or the wellness of using wood and impacts on productivity. So there's been a lot of formal research that's been done looking at the benefits of using timber products. One of our speakers this afternoon, David Rawlinson, will talk more about this. So I'm just going to give a little quick grab, because if we're talking about putting timber linings and timber flooring in a building, why would we bother doing that? And that's because we wanted to have that intimate or engagement with the environment. We love to be surrounded by natural products. And it's shown that there's been some real positive benefits on learning, particularly with children. I talked about mid-rise buildings. I've always got, every time I talk or think about this, there's this one photo I saw of a cross-laminated timber building that was done in the UK. And it's done as a school building, and they had this really beautiful cloud window cut out, and then they had a photo of children at a desk. They were really young, they might have been 7 or 8, just playing around, and it really gave, almost like this photo, this really engaging a feeling in using timber products. And we do have that innate need to be in contact with nature. But it also shows some benefits in sort of that reducing stress on the body, has the ability to lower heart rate and remove that stress. So there are some real positive benefits in using timber in terms of our built environment. Look, that's a very quick overview, but all I can say is go to the Wood Solutions website. If you haven't registered already, go to the website and register. There are webinars that are held almost every fortnight on a whole range of different timber topics, and I just encourage you to do that. So look, I'd like to leave it there, and thank you so much for your attention.
I've got one question that looks at timber group numbers and looking at what can be done if you want to use timber species that are not actually listed on the Wood Solutions report.
Yeah, look, I mean, our report, we've tested, I suppose, the most commonly available commercial species, but I know there are products that come in from overseas that may or may not have the information. So the first comment would be you talk to the supplier to see if they do have that information. If not, the test isn't all that expensive to actually get a group number. It could cost you in the order of a couple of grand to get that done. So if it's not on our website, then we don't have it, basically. So we have put on every bit of information we have. If there's a new product or a new species that we don't have, you'd have to talk to the supplier to just get the appropriate documentation from them. Always thinking evidence of suitability. If I'm doing a building, and then actually I had this on a major commercial building site in New South Wales, and I got a call from the developer who said, I've got to hand the keys over tomorrow. Do you have any test data for this flooring product that I put in? It's actually thinner than what you got on your website. Thankfully, we did have something because that particular product wasn't being manufactured any longer. But can I just encourage you, before you go specifying products in your specification list, make sure you've got the evidence to use that product.
Yeah, thank you, Boris, for a great presentation. You mentioned in the product groups for the fire resistance, you said the Group 3 timbers generally needed to meet about a 400 kilogram mass.
Yes.
Is there a rough average for what they need to meet Group 2?
Group 2 is a difficult one. Basically, my first comment would be if you're going to try and get to Group 2, a or a natural timber product won't achieve that. You'd need to look at some sort of fire retardancy applied to that product. The step's too big to go from a Group 3 to a Group 2 without doing something to that product. So that's probably the simplest way to do it. It won't be a density relationship for that, and we've tested a whole range of red iron barks in our list, and it doesn't achieve Group 2. Maybe it's getting up there, but the criteria for achieving a Group 2 is a bit too tight for I'll call it a natural timber product with nothing further done to it.
Just a couple of questions on the live stream with regards to terms and definitions. So we've got one that asks, what is DTS?
Deemed to satisfy.
Fantastic. Yeah. And what is flashover?
Flashover is when you've got a fire growing in your building, and then it gets to a temperature where all the contents within that space ignite. It just flashes over. You see it on movies where this whole thing just goes whoosh. That's the point of flashover, where all the contents ignite.
Point of ignition.
Yeah, point of ignition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Ian Davies from AFA. You were talking about the flame retardant treatments. Could you comment a little bit more about what's happening in that space? What are the products that are coming through? One presumes that PFAS is no longer on the board.
Yeah. Look, from the fire retardancy perspective, board products seem to do that quite regularly. So like an MDF substrate, they will have fire retardant treated MDF board products. There's been some fire test work where there've been fire retardant, I'll call them the MDF substrates with a veneer on it, that have achieved Group 2 performance, because the veneers are usually quite thin. So they may burn very quickly, and then it's just the board acting as a fire retardant board. So you can achieve that. Solid wood gets a bit harder to get the treatment through that timber. So that's why one slide where I had, let's not confuse the National Construction Code fire group number type discussion and bushfires, because they're different. So if we're talking about using it within a commercial building and getting fire retardants into that, I'm not aware of any solid wood products that have had that applied to them, but I am aware of board product with a timber veneer on it to make it look like a panelised product. So I don't know, maybe I'm not aware of products that can achieve that, but I'm not aware of them at the moment.
And I've got a follow-up question from the live stream on that point as well, and that is, if the interiors have timber products, wouldn't the surface finish depict the flammability? And obviously the exacerbate of the flammability.
The NCC actually does allow you to use paints and finishes with no real requirements on there. It really looks at the substrate material. So because the finish is going to be quite small, yes, it may add, but also in in comparison to the product itself, there's probably a small bit, like it might flicker or ignite or burn a bit, but then the substrate then becomes involved. So the National Construction Code actually exempts film finishes as having to meet the requirements.
Thank you. Hi, Boris. Just in terms of the NCC's review of the codes, how often do we think that's going to occur, given that there are so many advances in technology? For example, we're already seeing 3D printed, products from timber materials.
Yes.
And also we've just completed a federal government project identifying chemicals of concern, which will be banned within the next 5 years. So there are 9 chemicals, which clearly could be contained in some of the NCC codes at the moment.
Yeah.
What are the kind of timelines for this review or ongoing reviews to occur?
Look, the NCC goes through a 3-year cycle review. So from now it's every 3 years. So we're going to get the review happen probably after the NCC 2019 came out. People then submitting proposals for change, and you've got about a 2-year window so up to about 2021 to get your submissions in, and then they take 12 months to go through, look at the comments, review. They've got a technical committee that look at all the submissions and make recommendations for changes to the code. So that's sort of what happens within a 3-year block. So the next change is now coming out. It's meant to be 1st of October, but they haven't made that announcement yet. They said it wouldn't be earlier than 1st of October. So when that is, we'll find out. But so when that comes in, so the next one will be 2025. We made submissions. That comment I made about timbers of 400 kilograms a cubic metre or greater achieving Group 3, I'd put a submission in for the 2016 version that got sort of knocked back, went to the and then I rehashed it because based on all the overseas data, it makes sense to me that it should go in as a change to stop putting additional pressure on specifiers, having to chase reports down. I just think it's ludicrous when the Europeans have this blanket, achieve 400 or greater, you can use it. We should do the same here. And New Zealand do something very similar. So we're sort of, Australia's here, New Zealand are happily going off doing stuff with timber, saying you achieve in effect Group 3. Europeans are doing it, and we're sort of here saying, no, we don't accept it. So maybe I should make that public comment, but I find that really frustrating. So our submission's gone in again to make that change, and we had a couple of others that, unfortunately, with the clause changes and the formatting changes, couldn't get. We were told there was triaged for consideration for now 2025. So things that I've put in 3 years ago now have to wait till 2025 to see if they get through. But that, to answer your question, Patricia, it's every 3 years. But if you well, look, if you have an issue that you want addressed, you need to go through a formal proposal for change submission. It's on the ABCB, Australian Building Codes Board website, and you can just put that in. It doesn't have to be too detailed. I mean, I was going to say the changes the proposal we put in to get us to 8-storey timber buildings was big. Like there was a lot of pages, a lot of test reports, and a lot of analysis work. But for a comment about treatments, chemical use or whatever, I think that wouldn't need to be too detailed. You'd have some technical supporting information. The ABCB asked for specific questions to be addressed, and who have you engaged with, what the stakeholders think, what issues came up, how do you address those? So there's a bit of a process to go through, but if there are some things that you're saying, okay, these are coming and as a code should be aware of, all I can do is suggest that you, as an association, or put through a submission.
Thanks, Boris. Great presentation. Now, we use a lot of manufactured timber products, LVLs and all. So what about the index for those products? Any testing has been done?
So indices for things like laminated veneer lumber for use. Look, it's really about the timber that's used in that product. Now, laminated veneer lumber is similar to our glue laminated timber products in terms of the glue lines that are used so that they don't get affected by heat. So you start to jump between performance as a surface to performance as an element. So if you're talking about an element procedure, we've got a engineering standard, AS 1720 Part 4, that talks about fire resistance, so you can actually calculate char rates, put that char rate on top of your beam to then get a performance for 60 minutes, 90, 120, whatever. You can design that beam from a fire resistance perspective. So If we're talking beam elements, that's slightly different to surface finishes. But I have seen LVL, I'm out west, and there's a shopping centre where they've used LVL spaced beams as the ceiling. So they would have to then look at the fire performance, but it would be based on the species. And with an LVL, it would be the thickness of the product. As long as it wasn't less than 9 mil or whatever the report says, you would then be able to use it.
Yeah, but LVL uses a lot of imported different species, right? It would be really difficult to.
Look, if it's coming, I suppose I was thinking more local. We've got one manufacturer in Australia that does laminated veneer lumber who use local species. If it's coming from overseas, it'd almost be that comment about what if there's this timber that's coming in that we don't have information on or there's no report on. You go back to the supplier and you say, I've been asked for this, fire resistance or spread of a flame or whatever the requirement is. Can you provide me with that data? It's one of those things, I think from a design perspective, and it works very well with timber buildings, you need to do a lot of that thinking up front. So you get your buildings, once you've got your building design done, I'm thinking of like multi-storey buildings, the flow then is very easy. You get all the work, timber buildings you do more up front and the rest then goes smoothly. Other buildings, I know you chop and change as you go along to the end point, but I think the mentality now is changing that we want, and this is what's happened in New South Wales, they want the documentation up front so that you know what's meant to be built, everything's certified and everyone knows what they're meant to do. That suits timber. That's right in the timber sweet spot. We want that sort of everything done up front because we've got the systems and it'll all be put together.
Thanks.
Boris, Chris from the BDAA. Look, a lot of people talk about the products and the flammability of products, but I think a lot of questions need to be put into the installation because, basically when you've got the air gap behind, you're predominantly simulating a chimney. And as you've seen overseas, and I guess in Australia as well, a lot of these fires might be on the 12th floor, but they're coming out on the 20th floor on the outside of the facade. And I think that a lot of installation processes need to be checked because I think a lot of them are currently wrong.
Yeah, whether or not they're right or wrong, I don't know. But all I can say is that, as I was talking about systems, we're talking about buildings and cladding systems attached to them. From a building code perspective, timber's basically now limited to 2 stories on apartment type buildings. If you've got a couple of exits, we used to have 3 and my submission's gone back in again. I think the 3 levels is right. As I've said to the regulators, you can imagine if there's a fire on a building, 3 levels, the firefighter stands on the footpath and puts the hose on it and puts it out. But when you start talking about 8-storey, 10-storey buildings, I wouldn't be pushing a combustible cladding on it, which I'll make the comment, it was never meant to be. Combustible cladding was never meant to be permitted, but we've seen the effects of that. But you are correct. Any system that's been tested, and that's why I was sort of maybe labouring that point, when you go to a test lab, you're saying, they can do cladding tests. There's a cladding, I've gone blank on the number, so you can actually do a cladding test, but they'll nominate, this is how that system was put together, this is how it must be in effect installed in accordance with that. Any variation, then a certifier or building surveyor or building certifier should be saying, that installation doesn't meet this test report, go get that reassessed or get it retested.
The only issue is that most of the systems are already on when the guy comes and certifies.
Well, that's, I can't, I wish I had the ability to sort of do, push people to actually do things as per the plan. The plan says this is the system, this is what's meant to go on. I think there was a comment about substitution earlier, and that's where we ran into all sorts of trouble with cladding systems on buildings. So.
Part of the code mark certifications that we actually inspect the installation as well, because it makes up part of the certification.
Yeah, oh, that's good, yeah, and which it should.
And we just had a live stream question come through, which I think really supports that. Do you think timber should get automatic DTS on cladding 3 levels or less as it is low risk?
Well, I'll get myself into trouble. Since
we don't have Dorothy Dixon questions here. So.
Since the mid-90s, we were able to do that.
Yeah.
With the cladding fires that we've seen happen, not only overseas, but in Australia, we had a couple of cladding fires here. I think everyone got very scared and said, we're not going to put any combustible cladding on buildings. And my comment earlier that if you've got a 3-storey building, the firefighters can do that from the footpath. Like they can put a hose on the thing. And I think that was always the intent. The National Construction Code went through a very detailed review of fire requirements, and one of the reports looked at cladding, and this was done back in the, I want to say, late 90s or mid 90s, where they basically said what I'm saying now, that low-level buildings aren't a risk, the higher ones are. And that's still my view. I must say, I've got a fire engineering background as well, and that's still my view, that low-level buildings aren't a risk. We would build a 3-storey house with timber cladding on it, but we're not happy to do a 3-storey apartment building with cladding on it. It doesn't sort of ring true to me.
Yes. I think you mentioned before the 8-storey building.
Yeah.
With timber structures and
Yes.
stuff like that. Is that a proposal to NCC or it's already out there?
It's already there, so you can now build. Back in 2016, when we first got the code change, you could only do apartments, hotels, and office buildings up to 8 stories, but it's protected. So you won't
timber,
see
fire-protected timber.
Yep. Now you can build any building up to 8 stories with fire-protected timber.
So are you saying it's just class 2 apartments, or
Everything.
is it allowable like mixed use? Like
Yes.
you've got class 2s, you've
Yes.
got class 7A, class
Whatever
5 and 6 in the whole building?
Yes, whatever you do with any other material, you can do with timber. The
Right.
buildings need to be sprinkler protected.
Oh, okay, yes, so, because that's actually just under 25 metre
Correct,
height.
correct.
So, which leads me to the next question. In 2020, I actually contacted you about the FRL 90 minutes.
Yes.
Construction details.
Right, yes,
Yeah, I'm
yes.
City from
yes,
Arkside.
Yes, g'day, nice to see you.
Yeah, finally, yeah. And then I think that report for the fire from
Yes,
the Warrington fire,
yes.
that was like an amendment to
Yes.
that details that you provided.
Yep.
So is that being looked at furthermore, or is that being considered in the manuals that you provided?
The manuals will make reference to
that,
using the
okay.
appropriate fire resistance. Sorry, we're talking a bit technical stuff at the moment, but it's
Yeah.
child locking details.
Yeah.
So that assessment report from Warrington Fire, you can now use with the report with the
it is,
guide
yeah?
as it is, because
Okay.
that's from an accredited testing laboratory, and they're saying doing it this way will give you a 90-minute fire resistance level.
Okay.
So you can automatically use that.
All right, good.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, just about us being able to go up to 8 stories and the NCC developing hybrid structures. So at the moment, we just get a fire engineer involved and whatnot. But do you think it's still too nuanced for the NCC moving forward to consider hybrid structures and how you can get them into hybrid structures? We're looking at something that's about, where are we at? 40 stories? 40 stories hybrid timber structure. Obviously, we're doing that with a fire engineer,
Yes.
but consider Atlassian and everybody else is considering these things moving forward. Do you think the NCC will actually be able to accommodate that without
in
being
future.
performance? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Look, it was quite a big step for us to go from no timber buildings to get timber buildings in. It wasn't just we had an idea and we just went out and asked, can we do this, please? We engaged with stakeholders, as the process I was saying earlier. So the main issue with us protecting the structure with fire-grade linings was because of the fire services. So they had some concern, this is new to us, we don't know how we're going to fight the fire. So we said, okay, we will then protect the structure to remove that concern, and we'll also have the sprinkler systems throughout to then give us that additional performance. In terms of hybrid structures, look, there are buildings, and I think David, was showing, or Jorge, I can't quite remember, showing the buildings in King Street, 25 King.
I think it was Jorge.
Was it Jorge? Yeah, just fully exposed elements. So, beams, columns, floor slabs. It can be done. That will be done, as you say, with a fire engineer. I'm thinking about a proposal to try and strip away some of that plasterboard under the dean to satisfy. I think going to a fully exposed building is probably a step too far for us. But work that's been done overseas in America, basically showing that if you've got an apartment and you took away plasterboard off one wall with a solid mass timber wall, has no impact on fire. or you can pull that whole wall off and partial sealing. It may not be right up. It's the junction of the ceiling to the wall where the fire can get through. That's sort of a bit of the question. So they can put like a partial sealing, fire-grade sealing, and then have it exposed beyond that. So they're the sorts of things that are running through my mind. How do we help designers who really want to express the structure without having to give it full protection? So hybrid structures it is currently a fire engineering approach, but I think I'd love to talk to you more about sorts of other things that you're thinking of, and then we can look to see how we can incorporate that as a future proposal. More than happy to have that discussion.
All good. So thank you very much, Boris, for your presentation today.